Hi, so I totally stole this PowerPoint, but we're going to use it anyway. This is a larger presentation about the beautiful era of 1871 to 1914, but we will today be focusing only on the intellectual changes of the 19th century and their impact on society. So we're going to kind of flip here through. Okay, sorry, that was weird computer glitchy type stuff. Okay, so let's focus on point 10, faith and science alone. Now, because of the wild success of the Industrial Revolution and increasing everybody's standard of living and introducing the idea of materialism into popular culture, people are feeling really jazzed about science because science, of course, is at the core of industrialization. Without science, there would be no Industrial Revolution. So a lot of people became interested in science. One such person, named Charles Darwin, took a trip on the SS Beagle all the way out to the Galapagos Islands to study, wildlife. While he was there, he became very interested in a certain type of bird. He found these finches that they were finches, but they weren't like any other finch, little small bird, than he'd ever seen before. And he realized that their beak shapes had changed over lots and lots of time. He didn't know how many years, but he realized that nature uses something called natural selection to kill off the species that don't survive well, and the species that do survive well survive because they have different traits or features of their bodies, or like their color, shape, etc., that keep them alive. These particular finches survived because their beaks were shaped in such a way that they could eat the insects that were on the Galapagos Islands better than other kinds of finches. The other kinds of finches survived, in places like England because, the wildlife was different there. They ate different kinds of insects, so their beaks didn't need to be shaped in that way. So natural selection is sort of nature's way, like this natural law, like Enlightenment idea, natural law, where species that don't have features that allow them to survive simply die, and the ones with features that do allow them to survive become the predominant feature. Oops, yeah, we don't need to send an error report right now. Okay, so he documented this in The Origin of Species that he published in 1859. Now, Darwin was a very strong Catholic when he began to research science, but he became what's called an agnostic, which we'll talk about in a little while. He wasn't so sure about the existence of God. The main reason for this is that he realized that after studying birds, he studied all these other animals as well, and he started to study monkeys, and he realized that the great apes, such as like gorillas, orangutans, and chimpanzees, had a huge resemblance to human beings, and he hypothesized that perhaps human beings evolved from apes because he saw evidence of species that changed over time. This is a theory. It has not yet been disproven, so it is a very accepted theory today in the 21st century. It is just a theory, though. So if you have personal religious beliefs or anything else that contrasts with that, I'm certainly not trying to tell you that it's correct, but it is a scientific theory that has not yet been disproven. Okay, so Darwin is going to change everything. Just like, in the scientific revolution, the idea of challenging tradition in favor of reason started with science and became applied to social issues, We went from the scientific revolution to the Enlightenment. The same thing is going to happen here. The scientific breakthrough, the idea of survival of the fittest in terms of biology's survival of the fittest, will be applied to society by this guy named Herbert Spencer. Herbert Spencer inadvertently, well, perhaps not so inadvertently, but is at the root of every genocide, of the 20th century, just about. He comes up with this idea of social Darwinism, the idea that survival of the fittest should be applied to human beings. This really complements what Malthus and Ricardo were saying earlier, back in the earlier 19th century and later 18th century, that, earlier 19th century, that human beings, if you're not able to survive because your wages are too low, or you got fired because the wages were too high and now you can't feed your family, well, I guess you gotta die then. Remember that whole idea of economics being called the dismal science? Well, social Darwinism builds on that idea. It leads to the idea of eugenics, the idea that the field is called biosocial. It's a biosocial way to sort of eliminate undesirable traits of our species, the human species. And so, for instance, if Adolf Hitler, and he will later in the 20th century, wants to eliminate people who have handicaps from the human gene pool. He could try to sterilize people who, make it so they couldn't have babies. And that's actually one of the things that happened during the Holocaust. They medically sterilized people who were deaf or blind or who had handicaps so that they couldn't have children, and that way they couldn't pass their, according to Hitler, what was called an undesirable gene. Hitler also named certain races as being undesirable. He called the Jewish people a race, which, they're not, but that's okay. And that's why he sort of was after their mass extermination. He was also after people who were gay. We'll get to that in the 20th century. But this idea of eugenics is just one that if you don't like a trait in the human species, we should eliminate it. We're going to skip these next points. We will come back to Einstein. We'll learn about him in chapter 28, but we're not quite there yet. So, that's sort of the dark side of science being applied to society in the 19th century. A much brighter side of science being applied to society in the 19th century is the creation of social science. Social science is the idea that we could apply scientific method not just to science but to society. As a result of that, we get a variety of new disciplines such as, the study of history, sociology, psychology, anthropology, the study of human beings as a species, etc., etc. Here, archaeology. There, I see it in the slide now. Okay, so psychology is the one that we're going to focus on. The big name that you need to know for this class for psychology is Sigmund Freud. Freud is one of the fathers of psychology, and he came up with the idea of psychoanalysis. He was very interested in people's dreams, and he felt that that was your unconscious, like people's unconscious, the part of your mind that you're not aware of, communicating to you, giving you signals about what's really going on, okay, in your subconscious mind. All right, so he would study people. He'd have them lay down on a couch, and he'd be like, so, tell me about your childhood. Okay, he wanted to know, like, what was your experience as children, and, like, what are you dreaming about? Okay, he wants to know, like, what's going on in your subconscious to try and figure out any problems that you might be having now. For example, maybe if you're an alcoholic, it's because, you had a secret crush on your dad, and your dad drank a lot, and you associate alcohol with your father, and so drinking is a way that brings you, in a way, closer to your father, goofy, kind of like crazy, fun stuff like that. Okay, so he wrote this book called The Interpretation of Dreams in 1900. In it, he discussed the role of the unconscious or the subconscious, below consciousness, in our lives. He classified 3 different forms of our consciousness: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is like everything that's going on underneath, sort of like underneath you. It's like very much identified with your emotions. AP Psych kids, you can correct me on Monday. But as I understand it, the id is sort of like all of your pent-up feelings, like, like your rage and your love and your lust and all this kind of stuff. So picture like a toddler, like, no, I want my Legos now! Okay, that, according to Freud, would be like their id acting out, okay, like your base, uncivilized kind of stuff, like, oh, I want things now. Okay, that's like your id talking. Your superego is your sense of restraint. It's sort of the part of your mind that says, no, you need to chill and wait for your Legos. You have learned since you were, 2 that you need to wait for your Legos. Okay, now your ego is the byproduct. Your ego is yourself. Okay, and it's like the part of you that shows. So even though I'm like really hungry right now, I'm still giving this PowerPoint because my superego is telling my id to like calm down and don't go running out of the building to go to Taco Bell. You have to record a lecture right now. And so me giving you this lecture is like you seeing my ego, okay? So we'll talk more about Freud in class and increasingly throughout, class. Okay, so we're not going to talk about nihilism today, but we will talk about agnosticism. Nihilism is more of a 20th century concept. So a new trend in philosophy is called agnosticism, and that was, we associated that earlier with Charles Darwin. Agnosticism was sort of for people who were not ready to give up on the idea of God, but because of their commitment to science and their scientific way of thinking, could not prove the existence of God. Agnostics are people who admit that there is a possibility of God, but because they cannot prove that God exists, are not certain about the existence of God. They're not saying, no, God doesn't exist. They're not saying, yes, God does exist. They're just saying, nah, could be. Okay, but you can't prove it. We will talk about nihilism and existentialism in chapter 28, so we'll come back to these ideas later. Okay. This is the last slide, so it's a short and sweet one. Anti-Semitism rears its ugly head increasingly as the 19th century kind of comes to an end, and certainly it's huge in the 20th century. Now, you'll read about in your reading this weekend in chapter 25 about how there's a Franco-Prussian war, a war between France and the Prussians, and the French lose. Well, the French are not so happy about this, and some French generals actually accuse this guy named Dreyfus of being a spy for the Prussians, and they're accusing him simply because he is Jewish. They're like, well, he's an outsider, we're going to single him out, and he was almost convicted. Actually, I think he was convicted, and he was eventually, it was shown that he was not guilty, so he got off the hook. I have to do my reading again, I have to remember. But anyway, he gets off the hook, and it's like a huge outcry of injustice there, and it sort of exposes a really ugly side of, the French by basically showing that they're anti-Semitic. The Dreyfus Affair specifically prompts people like Theodor Herzl, a German Jew at the time, to write Der Judenstaat, which means the Jewish state. Now, what is it an example of if Der Judenstaat, if people want Der Judenstaat, like the Jewish state? Which ism would that be? Socialism, nationalism? Bing, bing, bing! Yes, nationalism is the Jewish state. That would be self-determination, an example of self-determination. All right, so Theodor Herzl is considered to be the father of modern Zionism, and Zionism is the belief and desire that there should be a Jewish state. This is going to be huge in the 20th and certainly huge now in the 21st century. There was a women's movement going on later in the 19th century where women, of course, want the right to vote, the right to be treated as equals in society, and, it becomes increasingly successful. We'll talk about that a little bit more in class. The big thing I really want you guys to get out of this lecture is social Darwinism. We're going to be writing a paper comparing the ideas that Charles Darwin had about nature and contrasting them with social Darwinism. Okay, so remember, Charles Darwin did not intend for his theory to be applied to society, but of course Herbert Spencer does it anyway. So everything else here we're going to talk about later on in class. You guys did a great job. Thank you very much. Your secret code for proving to me that you watched this lecture is, tell me what this block says or something in class on Monday. I'm in Miss C's room. This is just random stuff she has in her room. Okay, I'm done talking. Have a great weekend.